So I'm really happy to be interviewing Steve Pifer. Steve is a colleague of mine currently at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford, but he was a former ambassador to Ukraine. He spent his a distinguished career in the State Department and has been involved with Ukraine affairs for many, many years. So, Steve, I didn't think we'd get to this point, but after that disastrous meeting in the White House on February 28th, last Friday, uh, I think that the prospects for Ukraine don't look good. You wrote a piece in the Bulwark, which I'll reference in the notes, that talked about the so-called negotiations up to that point, but it seems to me that uh, things have gone south even from that point. So do you want to give me your reactions to the meeting and where you think things are going at this point?
Yeah, no, I think Friday was a very bad day for Ukraine. I think it was also a bad day for American security interests. It was unfortunately, though, also a very good day in Moscow. I've watched that entire tape. I've looked at it several times. It just looks to me that the White House intended to ambush Zelensky. I'm not quite sure whether that was Vice President Vance on his own or it was pre-planned. But they, I think, went after him.
What's remarkable is that I've never seen a meeting in the Oval Office like that with even the biggest rivals of the United States. This basic lack of courtesy and respect. It was really quite astonishing and I thought quite shameful.
Yeah. Oh no, it was appalling, and it was also, I mean, perhaps Zelensky made a mistake by trying to do it in English. I mean, he's worked on a lot on his English, but I think he's still not fully comfortable in it. But still, I mean, again, to host that and then go after him, and then what I find also disturbing is that it looked like the White House attack machine was targeting Zelensky on Friday night, Saturday, and yesterday with for example, National Security Advisor Waltz and Secretary Rubio. And they're not leaving themselves some space to try to recover. I go back to an episode when I was posted at the American Embassy in Moscow back in the 1980s, and I think it was 1987. And Secretary Shultz came to Moscow. He met with Gorbachev, and there was an expectation that they would announce that Gorbachev was coming to the United States. And at the press conference, when Secretary Shultz said, "Well, we've had some glitches here, we're not ready to make that announcement yet," there was kind of an audible gasp from the press corps. But Schultz basically then handled it very coolly. He left himself space to maneuver. And within a week or two, Gorbachev's coming to the US. And I would have hoped that the administration would have left themselves some wiggle room now to try to rebuild a relationship, which I would argue is still very much in the US interest. But I'm not sure the White House sees it that way.
So it's very hard to see how Ukraine gets out of this. It really depends entirely on whether the Europeans can do anything. I mean, they certainly made a big show of unity of support for Ukraine after Zelensky got back to Europe. What do you think the prospects are for Ukraine holding on with only that support?
Well, I think yes. I mean, there was this large meeting on March 2 in London with a lot of European leaders and Zelensky. And I think British Prime Minister Starmer and French President Macron, both of whom had, good meetings in the Oval Office before the Zelensky meeting. I think they're going to try to see if they can sort of reestablish a relationship and get things back on track. That's worth doing, but I fear they're going to have an uphill battle. Now, Europe did double down on its support for Ukraine. I think from Friday night until yesterday, we saw virtually every major European country, with the exception of Hungary, basically say they supported Zelensky, they supported Ukraine. And I think they're going to try. I think that they've remained committed because they see Ukraine's fight as also a fight to protect broader Europe. I mean, they understand what's at risk here if Vladimir Putin should win in Ukraine. The question that will be difficult is, does Europe on its own have the defense capacity to provide what the Ukrainians need if, in fact, Donald Trump ends American assistance to Ukraine? I hope it doesn't come to that, but it could be a challenge then for the Europeans on their own.
I think that if you look at the manning levels and the tables of equipment for most European armies, they're just a fraction of what Ukraine has already got in the field. They simply don't have the equipment. They've let their industrial base, their defense industrial base, deteriorate very badly over the last 30 years. So even if the political will is there, it's not clear that they're going to be able to supply Ukraine materially.
Well, this would be a question now, and again, I wonder if well, we still have to see. I'm still holding on to the hope that American assistance to Ukraine will continue, though I wouldn't bet a lot on that. But maybe this is the time for the Europeans. They've been reluctant to do it. For the Europeans to go ahead and proceed now to seize the Russian frozen central bank assets. And if Trump will not send assistance to Ukraine, my guess is he would be perfectly happy to sell weapons to Ukraine. So use that to buy arms from the United States that Europe cannot produce now on its own. That might be a solution until Europe can get its own defense industry up and running.
To go back to the article that you published in the Bulwark, you gave an analysis both of Trump's relationship to Zelensky and his relationship to Putin. And it seems to me that his position in this negotiation is driven less by any real strategic calculation and rather by, these personal interactions. You want to talk a little bit about that?
I'll confess, I think I understand the Trump relationship with Zelensky more than I do the Trump relationship with Putin. But I believe that Trump does not like, perhaps even detests Zelensky. And it goes back to his first term. I mean, recall that the first impeachment trial was driven by the decision by the White House, by Trump, to stop assistance to Ukraine. And then it goes back to this phone conversation that he had back in 2019 with Zelensky. Now, Trump calls that conversation perfect. I have gone through that transcript of that conversation a half dozen times at least. You will not find a single item of American government business that Trump does in that call. He doesn't ask Zelensky to buy American liquefied natural gas. He doesn't talk about opening up the prospects for American companies to come into Ukraine and develop rare earth minerals. He has only one request, and that's about having Zelensky dig dirt on Joe Biden, who is then going to be Trump's likely presidential candidate, on this bizarre story that's been repeatedly debunked about Hunter Biden. And I think Trump looks back on that, and he in some way holds Zelensky responsible for his first impeachment. So I think that explains a lot about the relationship that we saw on Friday between the president and Zelensky. Putin is just harder to understand, other than I think Trump he likes strong men, he likes powerful people, he looks at Putin and he admires Putin. You go back over the last 10 to 12 years, you will not find any time where Putin has been criticized by Trump. And I go back to the 2018 press conference between Trump and Putin in Helsinki after they had met, which I thought was one of the most embarrassing performances by an American president overseas.
Up until last Friday.
Oh, I said overseas, overseas.
Okay.
But after this meeting with Putin, where Trump goes out and basically aligns himself with Putin against the assessment of the American intelligence community. So I do worry that as you said, I think a lot of this is driven by Trump's personal dislikes and likes. The only plausible geopolitical theory I have heard for why Trump may be reaching out to Putin, and you've seen 3 weeks now of concession after concession after concession to the Russians, with nothing in return. But the geopolitical rationale would be that they think in the White House that they can somehow peel Putin off of Xi and drive a wedge between Russia and China. And if that's the case, I think they fundamentally misunderstand how close the relationship between Putin and Xi is and how much Russia depends on China. Putin is not going to jettison and throw over Xi to put a bet on an unpredictable Trump who 4 years from now is no longer going to be in the White House. So if this is the geopolitical theory that's driving that they can pull this reverse Kissinger, I think it's almost, it fundamentally misunderstands the relationship between Moscow and Beijing and overestimates their powers of diplomacy.
Well, the other thing is, I think it greatly increases the likelihood that China is going to move on Taiwan. The Chinese are watching Ukraine, and they've just seen the willingness of the United States to throw over a former ally so casually. At this point, I can't possibly imagine that Donald Trump will come to the aid of Taiwan, a Taiwan that's being militarily threatened by China. I think that, what he's likely to do is he'll call up his friend Xi Jinping and they'll have a discussion, and he'll basically concede Taiwan to China and he'll go back to the American people and say, look, I prevented World War III because of my deal making and diplomacy. And then, Taiwan is lost as a democracy.
Yeah, if that's what he considers the diplomacy of peace by simply conceding to the Russians and the Chinese, we're going to face, the United States will face a world in a couple of years where China is dominant in East Asia, Russia is dominant in the post-Soviet space and perhaps even Eastern Europe, and the United States is going to find that Trump's policy of America first is increasingly meaning America alone. That's not in the U.S. interest. Uh, and I fear that Trump doesn't grasp the dangers of the course that he set himself on.
I mentioned to you before we started officially talking that I was just on Piers Morgan with Jeffrey Sachs. And, this is an argument I've had with him, for the entire period of the war. And it really has to do with Russian intentions. He, like John Mearsheimer and a number of other, I would say, Kremlin apologists, have basically taken the Kremlin line that Russia in this war has acted completely defensively, that the United States was relentlessly pushing NATO towards its borders, and Ukraine was the last straw, and they had to protect themselves. And basically, you would get to peace if you essentially allowed Russia to keep the parts of Ukraine that it had seized up to that point. But I think we all have skepticism that that's the long run intention, and that's really critical in terms of, the future of American policy. What do you think?
I think this idea that Russia launched this war because of NATO, the history of the last 30 years simply does not support it. Look, Vladimir Putin does not like NATO, but it's not because he fears a NATO attack. I mean, look at the last 3 years. If you look at the Kola Peninsula, that's some of the most valuable military real estate in all of Russia. It houses ballistic missile submarines, strategic nuclear bombers, lots of nuclear weapons. It houses the Russian Northern Fleet. Well, the Finns and the Norwegians who border the Kola Peninsula say that in the last 3 years, the Russians have reduced their military presence along the border by 80%. That doesn't suggest he's afraid of NATO. In 2022, in May of 2022, when Finland and Sweden announced that they were seeking membership, Putin's asked about it at a press conference. His initial reaction is, no big deal. So Putin doesn't fear a NATO attack. I mean, Russia has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. What Putin does not like about NATO, though, is he sees it as a constraint on his desire to reassert Russian influence and even physical control in the post-Soviet space and perhaps in Eastern Europe. The NATO enlargement was not a cause of the war, but it is a pretext that the Russians trot out, and unfortunately, people like Jeffrey Sachs have bought into it. But I look at what you're seeing now. I mean, this war really, to my mind, it's driven by Putin's neo-imperialist ambition. He is trying to recover parts of the Russian Empire that were lost when the Soviet Union collapsed back in 1991. And he said this in, I guess, the summer of 2022, so about 4 months after the Russians had launched the large-scale attack on Ukraine. Putin met with a group of business students in St. Petersburg. And one of the students makes reference to, well, Peter the Great conquered the Baltic states. And Putin says, no, 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 no. Peter the Great didn't conquer the Baltic states. He recovered historic Russian territory. And then Putin went on to compare himself to Peter the Great and said, "This is what I'm doing in Ukraine, is recovering historic Russian territory." Well, if one goes and looks at a map of the Russian Empire at the end of the 18th century, you're going to see that not a large part of Poland, the three Baltic states, and Finland were at that time part of the Russian Empire. So when he talks about historic Russian territory, I don't think his ambitions necessarily end with Ukraine. And if he wins in Ukraine, if Putin wins in Ukraine and has a couple of years to regenerate his military capability, he's going to pose a much greater threat to Europe and also to US interests. I think the Europeans now get that. I worry that Trump, Vance do not.
I think it's not just that they don't recognize this problem, they actually endorse it in many ways. I mean, we've switched sides. I think that before the election, my biggest fear was that Trump represented a type of isolationism that characterized the Republican Party up until Pearl Harbor. But I think that it goes further than that, that he actually likes these strongman leaders, as you were suggesting about his attraction to Vladimir Putin, that he aspires to be that kind of leader. He's personally praised both Xi and uh, Putin in those terms. And quite frankly, that's what he is. That's how he's behaving domestically in the United States. Ever since January 20th, he's not sent a single bill to Congress to get legislative approval. He's just issued a whole series of executive orders. These are called ukazes in Russian, right?
Yes.
These are decrees of the emperor, and that is the way that he would like to rule. And the thing that really struck me was that United Nations vote in which the
Yeah.
Europeans, on behalf of Ukraine, had issued a condemnation of the invasion, and the United States didn't just abstain, it actually voted against. China abstained. China abstained, but the United States voted against this resolution. And so it's that we are actively promoting Russian interest and not simply pulling back.
Well, no, this is again, I mean, this is what's worried me over the last 3 weeks is what you've seen a whole series of concessions. You mentioned the vote at the UN, where the United States joined with Russia, North Korea, and Iran in a very small group to vote against a resolution. And the reason we did so was because the resolution accurately named Russia as the aggressor. But go back to the middle of February when Trump and Secretary of Defense Hegseth start talking about the war between Russia and Ukraine and said, well, Ukraine cannot get back all of its territory. Ukraine can't hope to join NATO. And set aside whether, that might or not be possible. If you're going to be the broker, why are you starting to lean towards the Russian position before you even have the Russians and the Ukrainians negotiating? That was a misstep. And then after that phone call that he had with Putin, I think on February 12th, Putin comes out and says, we've agreed, to meet not once, but several times. What he did then was he broke what was an agreement among Western leaders to boycott Putin, and he did it without talking to anybody else. The next day he says, well, I think, we should bring Russia back into the G7 and make it the G8 again. My guess is if he had that vote now among the G7, he would lose 6-1. And then the first major engagement diplomatic we have is not with the Ukrainians, but it's Secretary Rubio goes off to meet with Foreign Minister Lavrov in Saudi Arabia. And you look, and those things are concessions to the Russians. I mean, what they see is it's the United States basically coming to Russia. And if you look at those concessions, I don't see a single thing the United States got in return. I mean, the commentary coming out of Moscow is basically jubilation that the Americans are now, quote, aligning with us in Russia, and that they were still saying that they will maintain a very harsh position in any negotiation with Ukraine. So there's been no movement by the Russians towards any kind of a compromise in Ukraine, no real move by the Russians on any issue of interest to the United States. And this is not the way to deal with Moscow. I mean, you make these kinds of concessions. Vladimir Putin looks at Trump and says, this guy is weak. I'm going to just sit back and await further concessions. They've really mismanaged their engagement with Moscow. And I look at that, and it's particularly ominous when you set that up against how they have basically turned on Zelensky. That's worrisome.
Yeah. Well, again, I think it's not just that they wanted to contain Russia and they just mismanaged it. I think that it's worse than that, that they actively want to encourage Russia. I mean, a couple of other th concessions. Our new Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, uh, announced that we're going to stop any kind of offensive cyber attacks on Russia. And I suspect that there's going to be a big push to lift U.S. sanctions and an encouragement for American companies to start. Well, in fact, that's happened already. He has encouraged American companies to start investing in Russia once again.
Yeah, well, yeah, no, I was absolutely appalled to see what that Hegseth had ordered a halt to cyber operations against Russia. Does he believe that the Russians have halted cyber operations against the United States? No way. And on the idea of encouraging American companies, my guess is they may try to encourage that, but American companies, typically have been pretty cautious about investment in Russia because they've seen a very difficult business climate. They've seen government manipulation. They are not confident in the rule of law. So I think Americans or companies are going to be sensible about getting back into Russia. But yeah, again, why are we doing this? There was an interesting piece by Gideon Rockman at the Financial Times maybe about a week ago, and his theory is that Putin kind of sees him, or I'm sorry, Trump sees himself as, well, I want my turf, and that, you would have the situation where Trump and Putin and Xi would sit down and kind of divide up the world into spheres of influence. So, Putin would have the post-Soviet space and Eastern, perhaps Central Europe. Xi would have Taiwan and East Asia, and Trump would have North America, maybe the Western Hemisphere, and each would kind of be free to do whatever they want in that area. And that, I mean, it sounds bizarre, this kind of this Yalta 2, where they would divide up the world. As one of my colleagues once said, it sounds like a bunch of 15-year-olds playing Risk. But if you couple that with the way Trump's talked about getting Greenland and making Canada the 51st state, you kind of have to scratch your head and wonder if that's what he's up to. I look at that kind of world, and I think that that kind of world would be disastrous for American interests because you would not divide Russia and China. So we would empower a Russian-Chinese coalition, which the United States would then face without our allies in Europe and allies in Asia. That would be America first, creating America alone in a way that would leave us in a very difficult situation.
It's a return to great power, 19th century great power imperial politics, and we are probably not the best imperialist among those leading powers.
I think the Chinese and the Russians are going to be a lot better imperialists than we will.
Yeah. Well, Steve, this is very discouraging. I think that all of us at Stanford have been pushing very hard to support Ukraine ever since 2013-14, when Russia made its first territorial move against Ukraine, because we all felt that Ukraine, that was the front line in a global battle between democracy and authoritarian government. I think that proved to be, unfortunately, absolutely correct. It was just an opening shot, and that conflict has gotten worse, and now the United States seems to have switched sides. And it's just to me totally appalling. And I think about all of our Ukrainian friends. We have in common many people that have come through Stanford that we've supported as people that really believe in Western democracy and are fighting for that. And now, their lives are at risk.
I agree completely with a lot of Ukrainian colleagues and friends, and I'm really, really disheartened to see that they have to watch what happened in the White House on Friday. And I mean, been either a practitioner or a close observer of American foreign policy for now 45 plus years. And I have to say, I look at the last month of the American flip-flop led by Trump. I can't think of another 1 month period in the last 45 years that has left me more embarrassed, appalled, saddened, dismayed, and disgusted by American policy. I hope that this is incompetence, not plan on the part of the White House, because you can fix incompetence. But I have to say that as each day passes, I'm beginning to worry really about where American foreign policy is headed. And it's not just, and maybe not even foremost about helping Ukraine defend itself, It's about creating a world in which I think the pursuit of American interests is going to be much more difficult because of the mistakes that the White House is making now.
Okay, Steve, I have to think back to the uh, Yalta European Security Conference in Kiev that I attended last September, in which a number of, uh, I would say, more centrist Republican colleagues were arguing that actually Trump might be better for Ukraine than Biden had been, because everyone at that point had been very disappointed at the timidity of the Biden administration. But it just goes to show that things can get worse
Yeah.
over time, and that Trump 2 has been very, very different from Trump 1.
And where are those Republican voices now? I mean, I think I've seen two Republican senators, Senator Murkowski of Alaska and Senator Langford of Oklahoma, who've actually come back and challenged what happened on Friday. But from sort of what we could call traditional Republicans on foreign policy, Lindsey Graham, Tom Cotton, just silence. Quite frankly, were I a Ukrainian, I would never give Graham a visa to come back to Kyiv because he just tossed them over for the sake of, kissing up to the White House.
John McCain is rolling over in his grave as we speak.
Indeed.
Steve Pifer, thanks very much for talking. It's not a good moment for America or for the world, but we're going to keep following it. So thanks very much for the conversation.
Thank you, Frank, and let's hope that we have some brighter days coming ahead.
Absolutely.